Thank you, Father Massey. It's late July in a far corner of northern Wisconsin called Land of Lakes, which required a special flight on a prop plane from O'Hare. No air conditioning. At a site best known as a place to do scientific research on mosquitoes. It's a wonder anyone came. But 5 college presidents, 2 bishops, and 19 other Catholic higher education administrators and intellectuals did. And after 3 days of work into a coordinated publicity drumbeat, they released the Land of Lakes Statement on July 23, 1967. Our shared task today is to reflect on the statement on this, its 50th anniversary. I win no profile courage by suggesting that a superb place to begin our reflection is the July 11th, 2017 issue of America, with an article written by my boss's boss, Father John Jenkins. But it's nonetheless true. I add for the record, and for any Notre Dame Human Resources staff are present, that I agree with every word in Father Jenkins' article, including every thought and every and. Now first I'll suggest 3 contexts that inform the meeting and what they might mean for the document's interpretation today. I base this on a little bit of research in the archives of Notre Dame, the archives of St. Louis University. There is a sort of Rosemary Woods 18-minute tape gap to add to our story. Apparently the meetings were taped, these 3 days meetings, and we tried to track down where do those tapes exist. They're apparently, if they still exist, in an office at the International Federation of Catholic Universities in Paris. I volunteered, of course, as for our civic duty to fly to Paris and see if the tapes are still there. We got a note back saying that the office will be reopened in October. They've taken a long Parisian vacation, so we'll see if we ever recover those tapes. Okay, 3 contexts. All the delegates were men, a fact ignored at the time and only partially explained by an explicit focus on the larger Catholic research universities, which were, of course, all led by men in the late 60s. The guiding visionary was Notre Dame's Theodore Hesburgh, then entering the 16th year of a 35-year presidency. Already a figure of international visibility, Hesburgh's energy and charisma had propelled him to not only a university presidency, but leadership of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and the upper ranks of papal diplomacy. But he was not alone. The surviving documents suggest that Hesburgh was closely allied with Father Paul Reiner, St. Louis University's president, and a leader in the Jesuit network that then and now set much of the tone in American Catholic higher education. In Hesburgh's papers, there's one sentence in a letter where he describes Reiner, this is 1968, as, quote, the best of the Jesuit presidents, and someone from whom he, Hesburgh, had learned a great deal. And I should say this was not from Hesburgh a typical admission. Later in the 1970s, Hesburgh worked in tandem with Boston College's Don Monum on a number of similar initiatives. Also in attendance was a young future cardinal, Theodore McCarrick, then the rector of Catholic University in Puerto Rico. The most important context was the just completed Second Vatican Council. Formally, the Land of Lakes document and the meeting occurred because of a request by the International Federation of Catholic Universities to reassess Catholic education in light of the Council. Hesburgh had become president of the International Federation of Catholic Universities in 1963, when the organization then was effectively defunct. And overcoming some resistance from Vatican officials in the Congregation of Education, but with the vigorous support of Pope Paul VI, he had constructed it into a vehicle for discussion of the problems facing Catholic universities around the world. The title of the Land of Lakes meeting, quote, the nature and mission of the Catholic University in the modern world, end quote, echoed the title of Gaudium et Spes, the 1965 conciliar document on the Church in the modern world. And Hesburgh and Reiner consciously saw Land of Lakes as an explication of Gaudium et Spes, since the conciliar document, as Hesburgh said, had, quote, only 15 lines on universities, end quote. Hesburgh's speeches in the period just before the meeting urged Catholic institutions to, quote, be very much in the world as leaven or light, end quote. This broad push for engagement with modern society, characteristic of Gaudium et Spes, included a more open attitude toward alliances with men and women of other faiths, notably Protestants and Jews. During these years, Hesburgh frequently spoke on the importance of the ecumenical movement, and he cheerfully authored a short tribute to Martin Luther. Working directly with Paul VI, he arranged for Notre Dame to run an ecumenical institute in Jerusalem, expressly charged with fostering dialogue between Catholics and other Christians. At exactly the same time, he placed on the Notre Dame board, which I'll get to in a second, the first Jewish trustees, a couple of whom helped fund the theology department's effort to be excellent in the area of the Hebrew Bible. At the same time, DC appointed Rabbi David Neiman, a biblical archaeologist, to the faculty. That was the first context. A second context was university faculty governance. Hesburgh arrived at Land O'Lakes having orchestrated only weeks before a governance revolution, shifting control, or ownership, I should say, of Notre Dame away from the Congregation of Holy Cross to a lay-led board of trustees. As the phrasing in the initial press release explained, Notre Dame had moved from, quote, exclusively clerical to predominantly lay control, end quote. St. Louis University, led by Father Reiner, had just preceded Notre Dame in this shift to a lay board, and almost every other American Catholic university, including Boston College, soon followed. The origins of this decision, too, lay in the Gaudium et Spes and the stress on the vocation of all baptized Christians, not only vowed religious. A gathering of Catholic educators in Rome, attended by Hesburgh just a year before Land O'Lakes, had included a speech by Yves Congar, one of the most influential theologians of the Council, on precisely this issue, the need for lay clerical cooperation in Catholic universities. Allied to this new conciliar vision were pragmatic considerations. For example, that governance of increasingly complex institutions had outrun the capacity of men and women in religious orders, that successful fundraising depended upon a deeper form of collaboration. We should dwell for a moment on the confidence and generosity inherent in this decision, the transfer of ownership to a lay board. A transfer of formal authority unusual in the history of higher education. This transfer was not comprehensive. The president of Notre Dame, for example, was required to be a Holy Cross priest, and a body of fellows within the board was charged with, quote, maintaining the essential character of the university as a Catholic institution, end quote. Similar wrinkles existed at other Catholic institutions, and a few leading figures, including the Jesuit John Ford, denounced the entire process. But it was a transfer, a calculated bet, as Hesburgh put it, on, quote, granting the laity a more independent and responsible role in the governance of Catholic institutions, end quote. Lay boards of trustees and a sense of collaboration imply faculty governance. The same year, Hesburgh and Reiner inaugurated faculty senates at St. Louis and Notre Dame. And the new university trustees at both places set to work on developing formal measures for faculty consultation in matters of appointment and tenure promotion. The enthusiasm of Catholic college presidents for faculty governance was less robust than their support for a lay board. Perhaps it still, understandably, is. Faculty governance at Boston College, Notre Dame, St. Louis University, and elsewhere was probably minimalist when compared to parallel structures at secular peer institutions. But even these tentative steps marked a decisive shift from the mid-20th century mode of university presidents simply appointing faculty and administrators. This discussion of faculty governance occurred simultaneously with strikes and work stoppages at institutions as varied as Dayton, St. John's, and Catholic University. Crises prompted either because of fiscal interventions in faculty appointments or perceptions of inadequate faculty participation in university decision-making. That was the second context, faculty governance, lay board. A third context was globalization. Attended by bishops from all over the world, the Council was one of the 20th century's most global events, the emergence of a world church in ways unknown since late antiquity. So too, Land O'Lakes. Recall that Land O'Lakes was only the North American discussion of the future of Catholic universities. Other discussions occurred in Colombia, Kinshasa, Zaire, Manila, and Paris. And these groups, too, produced reports differing in emphasis. I've read the reports, but with the same tone as Land O'Lakes. Recognizing these three contexts, the Second Vatican Council, the Gaudium et Spes, lay leadership and faculty governance, and a more global church, should cast doubt on one criticism associated with Land O'Lakes, that its authors understood a diminishment of Catholic identity as a necessary step to compete with or mindlessly imitate UCLA, and Northwestern. Quite the opposite. The authors saw themselves as fostering a deeper Catholic identity, one predicated on shared responsibility and penetrating more effectively into both the classroom and student life. The authors did want to distinguish, or did rather to distance, the Catholic University from, in their minds, clumsy and inappropriate attempts at ecclesiastical control. Hesburgh had thwarted one such intervention from the Holy Office in Rome in the 1950s, as Father Jenkins reminds us. The one university president who publicly dissented from Land Lakes, Catholic University's William MacDonald, had recently prohibited a speaker series with luminaries actually from the Second Vatican Council on the Catholic University campus at the express but secret wish of the apostolic delegate. MacDonald's censorship, in turn, dismayed the United States cardinals most involved in deliberations of the council. And these cardinals were also on the Catholic University board, Albert Meyer from Chicago and Joseph Ritter from St. Louis. And these cardinals, even then, in 1966 and 1967, thought it obvious that such censorship damaged the reputation of the university and, in fact, was impossible in an era of modern communications. In one of the preparatory papers for the Land Lakes meeting, the historian John Tracy Ellis worried that bishops were on the verge of antagonizing Catholic academics newly committed to academic freedom. So, while they worried about efforts at episcopal efforts at control, the authors of Land Lakes still wish to have, quote, the point of the document, Catholicism perceptibly present, end quote, in all facets of university life. This new phase in Catholic university life seemed to them a natural renewal of institutions begun in very different circumstances. So just as the council had transformed church teaching on the Jewish people and other non-Christians, and had inaugurated a new vision of religious freedom, so too did Catholic universities require charters and practices consonant with the best university practices, best secular university practices in the mid-20th century. In this sense, the Second Vatican Council was the origin of a discussion that continued at Land Lakes, continued with Ex Corde Ecclesiae in 1990 and beyond. It tried to imagine how Catholic institutions would flourish in a new age. Was this imagination adequate? An immediate objection might be that the authors of Land Lakes may have understood themselves to be deepening Catholic identity and institutional excellence. But the gap between their intentions and subsequent reality led to secularization. It is a reasonable argument. When the authors of Land Lakes forecast large numbers of vowed religious playing a role in many academic departments, they did not anticipate the crisis that would soon grip religious life, as vocations plunged and departures from men's and women's religious orders accelerated. One Catholic University president at the meeting who signed the document left the priesthood 3 years later. This exodus eventually stabilized, but modest recruitment numbers and institutional growth on the part of colleges and universities ensured that vowed religious would become steadily less visible on Catholic campuses over time, a trend that alarmed even sympathetic non-Catholic observers. The authors of Land Lakes could see, but could not fully grasp, the impact of continued Catholic assimilation into American society. Did it matter, for example, that the percentage of Catholic students at University of Illinois Chicago was only slightly less than the percentage of Catholic students at DePaul? Or that Seattle University and Portland University were located, both Catholic institutions, were located in a region already becoming seen by the late 60s as unchurched. Similarly, what would Catholic identity mean for faculty, many not Catholic and many more, even if they were Catholic, never having worked for or studied at a Catholic institution? What would that identity mean for faculty who are instinctively more loyal to the disciplines in which they are trained than the institutions at which they work? Neither could the authors foresee a recent dramatic uptick in young people with not only a minimal religious background, but an unprecedented willingness to abandon that background once freed of parental influence. Finally, the authors of Land Lakes could hardly have predicted the financial strains on private colleges of all sorts. The late 60s were actually a vulnerable financial moment for many Catholic colleges. Boston College, as Joan Toole has elegantly reminded us, almost closed in the late 60s and early 1970s. But today's challenges, especially for small Catholic colleges, are more fundamental. Father Reiner described tuition as fantastically high in a letter he wrote to Hesburgh in 1967. But he did not lose sleep over his tuition discount rate. Now, I said the strongest criticisms of Land O'Lakes are reasonable. I did not say they were convincing. Land O'Lakes insists that Catholic institutions must engage the world, not retreat from it. And this larger sense of engagement also underpins Gaudium et Spes. Viewed 50 years on, this focus on engagement, not capitulation, has aged well. Engagement presumes that the modern world, including the modern research university, is fundamentally good and worthy of such engagement. And it presumes that Catholic universities might both offer something to this world and learn from it. Not everyone agrees with these assumptions, and prominent voices have urged Catholics to retreat from a putatively decadent American culture, to view themselves, certainly now, as strangers in a strange land. Hesburgh and Reiner and the other people who were involved in Land O'Lakes had neither that desire nor that luxury. In 1967, as Hesburgh especially passionately knew, not a single Catholic university ranked even close to the upper quartile in terms of graduate program reputation. Not a single Catholic university was in the top 100 for endowment. Not a single Catholic liberal arts college was perceived as premier. Faculty at Catholic universities were significantly underrepresented in national awards or fellowships. Their salaries were uniformly low. Smart outside observers in the late 1960s predicted that the most talented and ambitious Catholic undergraduates would soon no longer attend Notre Dame or Boston College or Holy Cross or St. John's. Instead, they would flock only to Harvard, to Williams, to Amherst, to Michigan, to Stanford. Mediocrity, then, not secularization, seemed to Hesburgh and Reiner and Monin their biggest obstacle. And they dedicated their careers to achieving academic excellence precisely because such excellence was the best long-term strategy to assist the church. It's striking, for example, that the term excellence is the most used piece of vocabulary, excellence, in Donald Monin's address upon becoming president of a nearly bankrupt Boston College in 1972. Retreating from that commitment seems implausible now, certainly for Catholic research universities, even if the path forward requires sustained reflection from all parties. Local Jeremiahs urging withdrawal do so in a nation where Catholics constitute a full 20% of the population and are as numerous in Congress, on corporate boards, and other leadership sectors as any other religious group. In this sense, Gaudium et Spes, and on a much more modest scale, Land O'Lakes, marked for modern Catholicism an acknowledgement of responsibility for societies Catholics have helped create. Land O'Lakes got right, too, the idea that Catholic universities' engagement with the world must include engagement with what was then called the Third World, but with what we might now term the Global South. Only in the 1970s, not during the putatively more orthodox era before the Council, did Catholic universities push to the forefront of student and faculty programs in social service, human rights, and related issues. Hesburgh, for example, spent much of 1967 and 1968 working with the Vatican on conferences and events to mark the 20th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Part of that global engagement was explicitly theological, what one Catholic college mission statement now terms a disciplined sensibility to the poverty, injustice, and oppression that burden the lives of so many. In the 1980s, bishops, theologians, presidents, and scholars wrangled over ensuring orthodoxy among Catholic theologians. What they took for granted, again, only since the Council and only since Land O'Lakes, is that Catholic college students should receive theological training, an area of inquiry as an academic subject, often reserved to seminarians before the Council. All colleges and universities, not just Catholic institutions, are more self-consciously global than they were in 1967, out of necessity. But there are distinctive Catholic versions of globalization. To mention just one example upon which our university presidents, I'm sure, can elaborate, and of course one that comes to mind because of recent headlines. The ongoing Latino migration to the United States is the largest demographic shift of the post-war era, and also, of course, the migration of a largely Catholic population. How institutions founded by European immigrants in the 19th century welcome, absorb, and transform themselves for the children and grandchildren of these Latino migrants surely constitutes one of our most important early 21st century Catholic identity tests. Now, to stress engagement, given the problems our society confronts, polarization, environmental degradation, achievement of human life, inequality, to stress engagement might seem counterintuitive. But the basic insight contained in Land of Lakes is confidence in the harmony of faith and reason, and this is stressed rather beautifully by Father Jenkins, and the desirability of a church acting in the world as opposed to a sect withdrawing from it. Our 19th century predecessors chose to found colleges and universities when they might have done many other things. Monin, Reinert, Hesburgh, and their allies, lay and clerical, chose to renew them in the 1960s, convinced that Catholic colleges and universities needed a new foundation if they were to nourish souls and better society. The Land of Lakes document itself, by the way, raise hands, who has read the document? This is an amazing group. Okay. The document itself, in my judgment, is of modest significance. It's a handful of pages. It's more aspirational than detailed. It's hazy about what Catholic intellectual life might mean beyond required courses in theology and philosophy, which seems to me actually a crucial issue in the current moment. Its authors, I think, would concede these weaknesses and cheerfully propose another retreat to discuss them. What would please them, and what we are about today, is strengthening that vision for our own time. Thank you.
John has agreed to take a few questions, so I'll take 3 questions. Is that okay with you? Good. Questions? Smart questions? Any questions? Yes, maybe.
John, can you talk a little bit about the communication strategy after they left Land of Lakes, and especially if these integrated were reconstructed, how it was received by different audiences, Catholic and non-Catholic at the time?
So the question you couldn't hear was, could I talk a little bit about the communication strategy after Land of Lakes and how it was received by audiences? My sense is it made less of an impact at the time than you would think. The Notre Dame PR office and the St. Louis University PR office, sent out memos and messages. And it got some attention. It was republished in a couple of Catholic periodicals. I think in the world of secular higher education, it kind of dropped like a stone and had no impact virtually whatsoever, and didn't have even that big an impact in the world of Catholic higher education. It slowly became absorbed. What happened over the next 20, 30 years is it became if I can use this term, a kind of fetish item in battles between conservatives and liberals over the church and when did things go wrong, and Land of Lakes became a statement about Lamas Humanae Vitae and others in that conflict around the late 60s. And listen, let's be clear, the late 60s and early 70s were a very turbulent moment in the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, probably globally, but also particularly in the history of Catholic universities. It's a very vulnerable moment for a lot of different reasons around curriculum, around Vietnam and everything else in university generally. And then there's this added Catholic dimension, so it's very volatile, and people understood that as volatile. And then after that, I think Land of Lakes took on greater importance. At the time, you'd be surprised. I don't think it was seems that significant. In the back.
Do you have any idea how the attendees were chosen? It seems strange that no one president was there from Marquette, Loyola, Santa Clara, Holy Cross.
So the question was, how did they get invited to Land of Lakes? And why wasn't the president of Marquette or Loyola or Holy Cross invited? The only hint I saw, and this was not a piece of comprehensive research, this was sort of done beyond my day job in one quick couple forays into the library. But the only hint I saw was Hasburger and Reiner kind of doing the invitation list and choosing the people they very explicitly thought were the best. And, you know, who was the most impressive and who was smart and who could we get to the meeting, who they respected. Now, I said, like any other meeting, there were invitations that they sent out and people couldn't come that particular weekend and that sort of thing, but that was the goal. Yes?
The document that we got lists a bunch of an interesting group of scholars that were involved in the preparatory work. Could you tell us something about that?
So I did read, there were, I think, 7 preparatory papers that everyone read as a way, you know, to prepare for the meeting. And they are interesting papers. I wouldn't say any of them struck me as earth-shattering, but on kind of theory of Catholic higher education, on the immediate past history of Catholic higher education, especially in the United States. I don't have an understanding, because we don't have a transcript of what happened at the meeting, how important a role those papers played. They didn't seem to really drive it. I mean, I think at least what we know, based on what I've seen in the archives, is it was an exhilarating 3-day meeting. They came out of it fired up, that they had thought through and done something new. The document itself was drafted primarily by Jesuit named Father Robert Henley, who was at St. Louis U then, and then it kind of ended back and forth by the group first, and then a little bit, I think, by Hasburger and Reiner after. So preparatory documents were there and non-trivial, and they're actually available in the archives. You can take a look at them yourself. I don't know how deeply they shaped the meeting. Yes, Ken?
If you look at the Catholic higher education scene today, you see almost 1,000 flowers blooming from, you know, St. Thomas More and Steubenville on one end, and you know, you get St. John's and DePaul and, you know, Notre Dame and DC in between, and they all have different ways of conceptualizing the engagement of Catholic tradition and the broader world. How much, and maybe there's no clear answer to this question, but how much sense do you think at the time of Land O'Lakes that the people who are drafting the document and involved in Catholic higher education thought about different ways of instantiating it, either according to different orders or different stances on the world or urban, rural? How much sense of the diversity within the unity was there?
I mean, I think that is a really interesting observation and accurate, that there are a lot of different ways, very naturally, because as Mark showed, that the sector of Catholic higher education is pretty big and pretty diverse. And so understandably, there are a lot of different ways to engage Christianity and to think about it. They were focused on the question of the research university. And really, there aren't elite Catholic research universities in the late 60s. But that was the ambition of most of the people at that meeting. We need to compete. And they saw this accurately. The research university, higher ed is generally very important in American society. And the research university has a particular place in American society that I think has only grown more important over the last 50 years. And a lot of things that happen outside of research universities, I'm talking Catholic and non-Catholic now, happen inside them now. And so they were concerned with how are we going to have a distinctively but serious Catholic version of the great research universities. And they were nervous that at both the research university and the liberal arts college level, which I think is the only two paradigms they were really thinking about, that Catholic institutions might get swept away. And that the best Catholic faculty and the best Catholic undergraduates wouldn't go to them. And that would be, from their point of view, a tragedy. A tragedy for the church, a tragedy for higher education, which could benefit from a different voice, and a real threat to their institutional stability. Kelly.
John, if those same people got together today for another conference, how would they assess how we're doing 50 years later?
in Catholic
Okay, now
higher?
that is a tough question.
Sorry.
I think,
You expected no less.
yeah, so, the question was, well, if those same people got together today, or an equivalent group, presumably the group today wouldn't be all male, and et cetera, et cetera. What would they say? That's an really interesting question. It's really a more diverse landscape now, and I tried to allude to the financial pressure now on private colleges, Catholic and non-Catholic, is much more intense than it was. And that, on the one hand, probably sharpens discussion of Catholic identity as people try to figure out what their market niche is and how they are going to thrive in the next 20 or 30 years. On the other hand, it places everything else in a slightly lesser key because you're trying to think through what are the programs and what are the strategies for survival in what is, despite talking about Ivory Tower, an intensely competitive industry. Yes?
So was there any discussion about the balance between having late ownership and having reserve powers on mission, and how do you continue to balance those two?
So the question is, was there any discussion of lay ownership and you said and bishops and
Well, reserve powers, particularly around mission.
yeah, and how do you, if I'm reframing the question accurately, you tell me, how do we balance lay participation in even control of these institutions with episcopal or clerical or religious order participation in their mission to ensure the authenticity of that mission? They didn't talk about governance at all at Land O'Lakes, so I should be clear about that. I just think it is the underlying context of much of what they do, because it's at the exact moment that Hesburgh and Reinhardt are orchestrating Land O'Lakes, they're also saying we need lay boards of trustees. And in that conversation, I think it varies institution by institution fairly dramatically. There was a lot of discussion about if we're going to have lay boards, how are we going to ensure, to use a religious term, the charism of our religious order, the sense of relationship to the church that the local bishop might provide. And listen, there's no one answer to that. And they didn't get into the details there, but that's clearly a challenge. An even deeper challenge now for Catholic institutions. In the back and right here, Jim.
You mentioned in closing that the document was chiefly more about aspirations than the details. And I just wanted to sort of continue this thread about lay and clerical. That predominantly participation was clerical. And the aspiration that in some ways the Catholic University would be able to sort of transform the disciplines, the academic disciplines, to an even higher plane. It seems to me that that's the piece that was an aspiration that they didn't have in detail for. And I'm just wondering if you think that, as clerical people, they just sort of assumed that because, that was their worldview, that would come along for the ride. And that the real pressure was on excellence for the moment. And that would just kind of naturally follow. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Did everyone really question that? I'm not so convinced of that. I take your point in that at a moment when probably religious order participation in higher education, and again, remember, members of religious orders could have done a lot of different things. Members of religious orders were more invested in higher education in 1967, Catholic higher education, than probably 8.4%. A massive personnel investment. And there's some truth to the idea that they probably thought, well, we'll be here, we'll carry the charism of our orders and our groups through these institutions. No need to worry about that. On the other hand, one of the things that is very striking for a document that's often accused of, and I disagree with this interpretation, of secularizing higher education, Catholic higher education, is the line of Catholicism should be effectively and perceptibly present in all facets of the university. And I think at the time there was a sense of what really is Catholic about our student life. What really is Catholic about our curriculum? What is Catholic about our commitment to social justice? All of which, at most Catholic institutions, we would take for granted now, but all of which is a fairly post-conciliar orientation, and we shouldn't romanticize, we shouldn't denigrate either, but we shouldn't romanticize the period of even before the Council, for example, in its commitment to social justice and volunteer opportunities for students. That's much better now, in my judgment, than it was then. And so, they were probably, like all of us right now, 50 years from now, I would propose we don't have a Land Lakes seminar. I'm not sure it's that important a document. But 50 years from now, they're going to look back at us and say, oh my God, how blind Reeve was. Didn't he see the train that was coming down the tracks when he gave that talk? And just then, and what they didn't see was the crisis in religious life. They probably had hints of it. You know, the recruit was already going down in the 60s. They did not see the tsunami that was going to go through religious life between about 1968 and 1975. Men's and women's religious orders. And they just couldn't see that. Jim?
You alluded to this a couple of times in the answers. When one looks at the signatories to the statement today, the most striking thing is that there are no women. And there were obviously plenty of women's Catholic colleges, unlike orders and sisters. What evidence, if any, is there of how the participants thought of that sector of the American Catholic higher education system? Did they think, well, those sisters' colleges are always going to be on the liberal arts end of the spectrum, so we don't really have to worry about them if they're concerned about...
Yeah, that's what I think it was, is that they saw the meeting as really about, can we carve out a role for Catholics institutions in the research university ecology? And if we don't think about this, we're not going to do it. And all the presidents of the research institutions were men. So I don't think it was disrespectful in that regard, but there was a kind of, I mean, you know, this is a different era, and nobody said boo in 1967. No one even thought to ask, why are there no women president? When, ironically, at a time when there would be more women Catholic college presidents in 1967 than there are now. I would guess, because there were so many women's religious orders and so many colleges sponsored by them. So it's a reminder of the blinders that we all carry with us. Yes?
I mean, just to kind of follow up on that, and this is more just an observation, kind of the word teaching. The idea that they're focused on a research university and kind of thinking about the role of teaching as well. You know, is that part of that conversation that, you know, the orders that are, the nuns, the schools that are sponsored by the female religious are going to kind of take care of the teaching and will be more focused on the research? I mean, I just find that kind of an interesting split that I think we're still wrestling with, you know, which side of the house and what's more important. And, you know, does the statement kind of ever really address what I see as, I think, something that's kind of a split at all universities, and then winds up denigrating sometimes how faculty kind of track their time and their energies and just.
You know, the one I largely agree with that, not entirely. They weren't focused so much on teaching, but then people in the 60s and 70s didn't talk about how to be a good teacher in the way that we do now. We have centers for teaching and learning, and et cetera. They weren't focused on curriculum. And so a lot of the document is about the role of theology and philosophy in these reconstituted institutions. I say this scarred by having led the Notre Dame Court Curriculum Review for 2 years, and, you know, a huge complicated process, and we think, we got to a very happy conclusion. But what's striking, and I think is a big challenge for Catholic universities and colleges now, is how to develop a distinctive and serious curriculum that connects the Catholic intellectual life in ways beyond theology and philosophy. And the expectation that theology and philosophy have to carry the whole burden strikes me as a very time-bound notion. It doesn't go back to Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century. And that notion, which is still around, I think is one that, and nothing's harder to articulate, but that the institution has to take more seriously about. Yes?
What angles do you see in this
connect Land Lakes to Exporte. And of course, Exporte is a much richer, more thought-provoking document. It's a document that came out of years of reflection and contestation. And, you know, it's because there is a sense of reaction to Land Lakes. The most famous line in Land Lakes, I'm not going to quote it exactly right, is about no ecclesiastical or civil control of the university. The university is autonomous, and Exporte has a different vision than that. It's not about the autonomy of the university, it's about the connection to the church. But there's also a good bit of language in Exporte about the autonomy of the disciplines and the respect, you know, the lead part of Exporte is about the individual scholars and institutions, the moral demand that they search for truth, wherever that investigation takes them. So I don't see them as especially in conflict with each other. I see them as kind of, they're different genres. There's a genre of, we're getting together for a weekend in rural Wisconsin, we're going to pound out 4 pages. That's one genre. Another genre is the Congregation on Education of the Vatican, etc. It's going to spend multiple years and have a huge fight about theologians and orthodoxy, and then we're going to produce doctrine. That's another genre. They're not really competing documents. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to call people's attention to the preamble, and it's almost apologetic for the document. Key sentence is, the statement does not pretend to present a full philosophy or description of the Catholic University. It is selectively and deliberately incomplete. So the document apologizes for its focus, its limitation. So my question is, why wasn't there a fuller explication, filling in of the gaps, and attention to the colleges and smaller universities that this document deliberately left out? Why in the next decade or two? Or maybe there was something that you know about.
No, I don't. That's a good question. I think it, you know, now remember, this was a North American statement, and then there was an Asian, a European, an African, and a Latin American statement. And these were all sort of put together in an International Federation of Catholic Universities statement that, as far as I can tell, had no discernible impact on practice. And I don't know, were people exhausted with manifestos and busy running their own institutions? I'm just not sure why it wasn't followed up. I mean, they were proud of the document, the signatories. They thought the statement about independence, the statement about we want Catholicism present in different ways than it was present and perceptibly present all throughout the university, they were very proud of that. And so maybe they didn't feel a need to revisit it. Yes.
I have another question about the financial pressure on, when Pope Benedict XVI was speaking at the Catholic University of America in April of 2008, he said this: countless dedicated religious sisters, brothers, and priests, together with selfless parents, have, through Catholic schools, helped generations of immigrants to rise from poverty and take their place in the mainstream of society. This sacrifice continues today. It is an outstanding apostolate of hope, seeking to address material, intellectual, spiritual needs of over 3 million children and students. It also provides a highly commendable opportunity for our entire Catholic community to contribute generously and financially to our institutions. Their long-term sustainability must be assured. Indeed, everything possible must be done in cooperation with the wider community to ensure that they are accessible to people of all social and economic strata. No child should be denied his right to an education and faith, which in turn nourishes the soul of a nation. Now, this statement of everything must be done in cooperation with the wider community to ensure that they are accessible to people of all social and economic strata. Is there anyone here who thinks we can come anywhere near close to that standard? I mean, it's not realistic anymore, is it? In light of the pressures on the institutions?
You know, thanks for the question and for the quotation. I mean, the whole question of accessibility is a serious and morally charged. I mean, there would be an argument, right, to say the real Catholic college should only educate first-generation immigrants, right? That you should just take on a particular sector of American society that's most in need of higher education. I don't think that's actually even a serious argument. Higher education in the United States is a very differentiated landscape. There are places at all spots in the spectrum of American higher education, and you want the Catholic sector to be represented in a lot of different spots. And so someplace like Trinity in Washington, D.C. has said, we're really going to focus on first-generation students and low-income students. That's terrific, and that's a Catholic mission too. And a wealthier place like Boston College or Notre Dame has dramatically increased financial aid, and is in fact more economically diverse now than it was 30 years ago. Nonetheless, it's a very expensive proposition. That's a very different sector of American Catholic higher education. So it has to be kept front and center, and maybe there's a bigger burden on Catholic institutions in this regard than there would be on secular private institutions. But don't underestimate the progress that's been made. Yes?
You've spoken about the connection to Ex Corde. Could you say anything about the connection to Bravissimo Educaciones, which had just been passed by the Council 2 years earlier?
No, because I actually don't know what it is. I haven't that, so.
It's the Declaration of Vatican II on the nature of Catholic education.
There's no connection.
Stand up.
The question was, it's remarkable that in Land Lakes, there is a very understandable neglect of the considered thing on education.
Okay, yeah.
It's one of the least significant documents in the history of the Second Vatican Council, because it was a very quick debate, and it was not seen at Vatican II as a substantial issue.
So I didn't understand the question first, but you mean the document on education issued at Vatican II?
Yes.
Which I honestly haven't read, but I did see a remark in the correspondence about how they thought the document was useless. And they were just going to kind of almost go forward as if it had not been written. And so that was their view.
One criticism of it is that it was still heavily reliant on an encyclical of Pius XI of 1929, and that the fathers thought that they should talk about this, but there wasn't, as you said, there wasn't a lot of preparatory permission for it.
I mean, that does get to a larger, and I think an interesting point. Remember, there isn't an equivalent, in my judgment, of the American Catholic higher education sector around the world, right? This is a vast sector. It's, as I said before, ranges from small liberal arts colleges to now major research universities. It's, well, I don't have my sheet in front of me, but it's at least a couple hundred institutions. That doesn't exist around the world, and I do think people like Hesberg and Reiner and Monin felt people in Rome don't get what we're doing, that we're in a competitive environment. This is a huge success. These institutions were built without, more or less, without state funding. It is novel, and we shouldn't take that for granted. This doesn't exist in France, or in Canada, or in Mexico, or in Italy, or many Catholic countries. It does exist in some parts of Africa, actually, where Catholic universities are absolutely central to higher education in the Philippines and other places, but it is not the norm that a big sector of what the whole world wants, which is higher education, is Catholic.